to the trenchers of this world. Between centuries of suffering and torment, many stories can be told, of good and evil, faith and heresy, naive longing and forbidden desire. In another age, the veneer of civilization would have been thicker, and the boundaries between categories more blurred. But this is not the age of the Trench Crusade. Here, moderation and coexistence are as thin as molecules, and great devotion is contrasted by utter hate. They are, after all, the same. The predator devours the prey. It cannot help itself. The angel cannot shed its light without burning the eyes of the innocent. So let us listen to their stories, lives and no lives spent unnoticed, not only surviving, but living and existing, if only for a moment. Let us listen to the voices of the trench. The static and the chain. In the grinding stalemate of the Great War, the front lines have become a place where reality itself is a contested territory. Beyond the mud and artillery barrages, a deeper conflict rages. One fought against infernal legions with weapons that scar the soul as well as the earth. For the scouts and specialists of the Red Brigade, duty means venturing into the nightmares that conventional soldiers cannot face, where the very air can whisper lies and the ground remembers every atrocity. This is a story of one such mission, a desperate raid into the heart of the enemy's domain, where the price of success is measured not in territory gained, but in the souls a handful of soldiers refuse to leave behind. Chapter 1. Orders in the Static. Simruk's world had shrunk to the dimensions of a listening post, 3 paces by 4, a burrow of sandbags and splintered timber sunk into the mud of Pulpit 9. The air tasted of damp earth and cordite, a permanent seasoning to every breath. Outside, the stuttering flares painted the no-man's land in fleeting bone-white snapshots, a skeletal tree, a coil of wire, the distant, humped back of a ruined basilica. But Sim's attention was turned inward, to the hiss and crackle of the trench radio. It was an old set, its valves glowing like tired eyes in the gloom, and its speaker offered only a relentless, empty static. Most of the Red Brigade scouts tuned it out, a background nuisance like the distant thump of artillery. For Sim, it was a different kind of weather. He listened not to the silence between the bursts of interference, but to the static itself. Sometimes, in the warble and hiss, a pattern would emerge, a cadence that wasn't random, a whisper that shaped itself into a syllable, a word that almost but not quite formed a name he knew, Alyssa. His wife's voice, or a cruel echo of it, woven from the ether's meaningless noise. He had long ago decided it was not a sign, not a message from beyond the grave or a trick of hell. To treat it as such was a path to madness, to seeing her face in every shell blast crater. So he categorized it as atmospheric phenomena, a peculiarity of this damned stretch of front, and he disciplined his heart not to quicken at its sound. It was just weather. Painful weather, but weather nonetheless. The scrape of a boot on the duckboards broke his concentration. A courier from the Pontifical Office of Biological Warfare stood at the entrance to the dugout, his greatcoat dark with moisture. He was young, his face pale under the rim of his helmet, and he held a sealed dispatch case as if it were a holy relic. "Scout Rook, orders from the Pontifical Office." Sim took the case, the worn leather cool in his hand. He broke the wax seal, stamped with the office's sigil, a serpent coiled around a scalpel. The message inside was brief, the script neat and precise. It spoke of last night's barrage, of a sacrilege tank mortar round that had done more than just explode. It had torn a hole, a temporary, cycling tear directly into the infernal plains. And into that tear had fallen Brother Pavel, a combat biologist, along with his field index. Sim read the words again, his mind assembling the implications. Brother Pavel. The man who a year ago had dug Sim out of a collapsed sapper shaft with his own hands, ignoring the whine of sniper fire and the creak of shifting earth. Pavel, who smelled of formaldehyde and faintly of incense, and whose laugh could cut through the trench's pervasive gloom. He was gone, but not entirely. The tear, the message explained, was expected to cycle open again. The physics of such blasphemies were grotesquely predictable, tied to the rhythmic stanzas of the infernal barrage. When the second stanza of the next bombardment began, the wound in reality would gape wide once more, for a few precious minutes. The field index was not just a ledger. Pavel had been compiling a list of reverse psalm calibrations, acoustic and spiritual frequencies that could, theoretically, blunt the soul-peeling harmonics of the sacrilege shells. The Synod of Strategic Prophecy needed it. Frontline chaplains relied on such data to shield entire companies from the weaponry that didn't just kill the body, but unraveled the soul. Its recovery was paramount. The courier shifted his weight. "They're assembling a team, sir, a small one. The window is narrow." Sim didn't need it spelled out. To cross into literal hell, even for a moment, was a suicide mission. The Red Brigade's unofficial creed, the one that had drawn Sim to its ranks after he'd lost everything, echoed in his mind, "Bring them back or do not come back." It was an oath born of shared loss, a promise between the damned that they would not leave their own to the dark. It was the only oath Sim felt he could still keep in this broken world. He thought of the static, of the ghost of a voice that was not his wife's. He thought of Pavel's hand hauling him back into the light. The debt was clear, the choice already made. He looked up at the courier, his own face a mask of trench grime and resolve. "Tell them I'm in," Sim said, his voice flat, the decision settling into him like a weight he was accustomed to carrying. "When do we go?" "The barrage is scheduled for 300. You'll brief with the team at 200 in the command dugout." Sim nodded, folding the dispatch and tucking it into a pocket. The courier left, his footsteps fading down the communication trench. Sim turned back to the radio. The static hissed, a sibilant rush of nothing. For a moment, he thought he heard the faintest inflection, a questioning lilt. He reached out and turned the dial slightly, tuning it away from the memory toward the pure, uninflected noise of the war. He chose the empty channel, the one that held no false promises. It was the only choice he could make on purpose. The mission was now the only signal that mattered. Chapter 2. 4 and a Prayer. The command dugout was a larger version of Sim's listening post, carved deeper into the earth and shored up with heavy timbers. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool, cheap tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of ozone from the field generator powering the single electric lamp. Its harsh light cast long, dancing shadows that made the occupants seem like figures in a cavernous puppet theater. Sim stood just inside the entrance, his eyes adjusting, taking the measure of the 4 souls who would cross into hell with him. Dr. Nura Al-Kindi was the first to acknowledge his presence. A combat biologist from the Al-Bastami School of 99 Names, she stood beside a makeshift bench laden with her equipment. Her focus was absolute, her hands moving with a surgeon's precision as she checked the seals on her vivisector. The weapon was a brutal piece of artistry. A long, polished haft of dark wood tipped with a cruelly curved blade, its surface etched with minute script. Along the blade's spine ran a series of glass vials and a hypodermic chamber filled with a murky, swirling cocktail. Sim knew its contents from briefings, sacred compounds distilled from relics, nerve agents brewed in the alchemist labs of the Sultanate, and microshards of holy matter, all designed to deliver a stop that was part mercy, part excruciating judgment. Nura looked up, her dark eyes sharp and intelligent behind a pair of smudged spectacles. "Scout Rook, the seals are holding, the cocktail is loaded." She tapped a vial with a gloved finger. "I will not leave him behind again." The statement was flat, final. It spoke of a prior failure, a debt of her own. Across the dugout, a woman was sketching on a sandbag with a piece of charcoal. Maeve O'Carroll, a Fianna skirmisher on loan from the embattled Green Isle of Ayr. She moved with a predator's stillness, her red hair a splash of color in the drab surroundings. Her sketch was not a map in the conventional sense, but a series of intersecting lines, angles, and countermarks. "The hunters of the left-hand path," she said without looking up, her accent lilting and sharp. "They read the land like a priest reads scripture. Sightlines are their verses. Our job is to break the meter." She drew a swift, dark line and then smudged it with her thumb. "Ashen misdirection. We'll be ghosts in their gospel." Leaning against the earthen wall, a broad-shouldered man with a calm, weathered face inspected a collection of Tufanjif mines. Umar ibn Hadi, a veteran sapper of the Iron Sultanate. He handled the ingeniously cruel anti-personnel devices with the care of a craftsman, his fingers checking the trigger wires and the shaped charge within. An Bosun shotgun, its barrel unusually wide, was slung across his back. "The tier?" he said, his voice a low rumble. "It will not want to stay open. Reality has an immune response." He held up one of the mines. "But a little charge, placed with the proper geometry and a little grace, can pinch the edges. Hold it for a heartbeat, long enough." The last member of the team sat on an ammunition crate, his head bowed. Father Thomas was a trench chaplain, his robes worn and patched. A battered reliquary of tarnished silver lay on his knees, and he was carefully wrapping thin strips of parchment inscribed with prayers around his wrist. He looked up as Sim approached, his eyes old and tired, but holding a core of unshakable resolve. "Sim," he said, his voice soft, "the Synod wants the index. The office wants its data. I will enforce only one rule on this mission. We rescue the living before we retrieve the useful." He finished wrapping the prayers and tucked the ends securely. Pavel's soul takes precedence over his work. Sim met each of their gazes in turn. He saw no fear, only a grim acceptance of the task. These were not raw recruits. They were specialists, each bearing the scars of a long war fought on the edges of reality. He moved to the center of the dugout, where a rough table held a chalkboard slate. "All right," Sim began, his voice low but clear, cutting through the hum of the generator. "We have one shot. The tier will open during the second stanza of the barrage. We go in fast, we find Pavel, we get out. Radios are useless where we're going. The interference isn't electronic, it's spiritual, so we do this by hand and eye." He picked up a piece of chalk. No jargon, plain words. Your hands need to know what to do without your heads having to think about it. He sketched a rough diagram on the slate. "Maeve, your point. Your job is to get us through the wire and then break the hunter's sight lines. You see a problem, you signal." He drew a quick slashing line. "Umar, you're on the tier. You place your charges to keep our exit open. Once we're back, you blow it shut behind us." He tapped the slate. "Nura, you're with me on the objective. You're the only one who can stabilize Pavel if he's compromised." He glanced at Father Thomas. "Father, you're our anchor. Your prayers might be the only thing that keeps the whispers out of our heads." He assigned call signs, simple designators they could hiss in the dark. Sim was anchor. Maeve was stiletto. Umar was keystone. Nura was mender. Father Thomas was simply chaplain. "We move in this order," Sim continued, rehearsing the sequence. "Stiletto leads through the wire. Keystone marks the entry point. We advance to the coordinates from Pavel's last transmission. Mender and I secure the package. Chaplain provides cover. On my mark, we fall back to the tier. Keystone primes the closure charge. We go through. He follows and detonates. Anything goes wrong, the priority is the man, not the book. Understood?" Nura nodded sharply, her hand resting on the vivisector. Maeve finished her sketch on the sandbag, a complex web of lines that somehow suggested a path of least resistance. Umar slid the last of his mines into a bandolier. Father Thomas stood, hefting his reliquary. "The static out there," Sim said, gesturing vaguely towards the world above. "It lies. It sounds like things you want to hear. Don't listen. Trust the person next to you, not the air." He looked at each of them again, this small fellowship bound for the inferno. Any questions? There were none. The plan was insanity, but it was a clear insanity. In the trenches, that was often the only kind of order you could get. Maeve smudged the final line of her charcoal sketch with her thumb, turning it into a blur of gray. "The sight lines are broken," she murmured, "for a little while at least." Father Thomas made the sign of the cross, not with theatricality, but with the weary habit of a man who had done it 10,000 times in the face of death. "May God have mercy on us all," he said, but the words sounded less like a plea and more like a statement of fact. The prayer was a tool, like Umar's mines or Nura's vivisector. Something to be used in the work ahead. Sim checked his watch, 0215. 45 minutes until the barrage began. The static of the waiting was over. Now, there was only the silent calibration of will, the final adjustments of gear, and the quiet dread that settled in the stomach before a jump into the unknown. They were four in a prayer, a handful of souls against the primordial dark, and their only advantage was the grim certainty of what they had to do. Chapter 3, The Wire That Listens. The world above the dugout was a different kind of dark, a vast, open maw of night, broken only by the intermittent cough of a flare. It cast a jerky, strobing light over the landscape of Pulpit 9, freezing the world in ghastly tableaus. A skeletal tree, a water-filled crater reflecting a sickly green sky, the endless, tangled expanse of no man's land. Sim led the team out of the communication trench, their movements slow and deliberate, each foot placed with care on the slick duckboards. The air was cold and carried the familiar stench of rot and cordite, but underneath it was something else tonight, a coppery tang like old blood on the wind, a prelude to the infernal barrage. They moved in the order Sim had designated. Maeve, stiletto, was a ghost ahead of him, her form barely visible as she paused at the edge of their wire, waiting for a flare to die. Behind Sim, he could hear the steady, heavy breathing of Umar, Keystone, and the softer footfalls of Nura and Father Tomas. The plan was solid in the dugout. Out here, under the open, hateful sky, it felt like a wish whispered against a gale. Maeve held up a closed fist. They froze. Ahead lay the heretic wire. It was not mere steel. It was a sentient barbed wire, its barbs glistening with a faint oily sheen even in the near darkness. It was said to flex towards heat, to tighten its coils when it smelled fear. It was the first guardian of the damned lands, and it watched them now. On Maeve's signal, Nura Mender crept forward. She uncorked a small ceramic bottle and began to mist the nearest strands with a fine, caustic spray. The liquid hissed where it touched the metal, and a sharp, acidic smell cut through the other odors. It was a sensor blind, a compound designed to confuse the wire's infernal senses. As she worked, Father Tomas, chaplain, stepped forward. He pressed his battered reliquary against each wooden post, murmuring a low benediction. The ancient silver of the reliquary seemed to pulse with a faint, warm light at the contact, and the wire, for just a moment, slackened. The coils loosened, the tension bleeding out of them as if pacified. "Go," Maeve whispered, her voice a thread of sound. They slipped through the gap one by one, a procession of shadows entering the true wilderness of no man's land. The ground here was churned into a viscous mud that clung to their boots. The ruins of a farmhouse stood like a blackened skull in the distance. They had gone 50 yards when the first sacrilege tank mortar thumped in the distance. It was not the sharp crack of high explosives, but a deeper, wetter sound, a rupture. The shell whispered as it traveled, a reversed divine word that scraped against the mind. Sim felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, a sudden, inexplicable grief that had no source. He saw Nura flinch, her hand going to her temple. Father Tomas gripped his reliquary tighter, his lips moving in silent prayer. Maeve was counting under her breath, her head cocked, listening to the cadence of the barrage. The shells fell in a pattern, a hellish liturgy. The first stanza was a bombardment of pure physical destruction, high explosives and shrapnel that tore the earth. The second stanza, the one they waited for, was different. It was the stanza that tore reality. "Get ready," Maeve said, her voice tense. "The cadence is shifting." The thumping grew louder, closer. The whispers became a chorus, a cacophony of unholy words that made their eyes water with a pain that had no physical location. It was an agony of the soul. Sim clenched his jaw, focusing on the muddy ground ahead, on the silhouette of Maeve's back. He could not afford to listen. He could not afford to feel. Then the world changed. The air in front of them shimmered, like heat haze over a furnace. The distant sound of the barrage seemed to stretch and warp, and the very light turned sickly, a jaundiced yellow. The ground beneath their feet lost its substance, becoming insubstantial. Maeve pointed a trembling finger ahead. "There!" A tear had opened in the fabric of the world. It was not a hole, but a thinning, a tunnel of wrong light that pulsed like a diseased heart. It smelled of sweet rot and hot coins, a nauseating combination that assaulted the senses. "Now!" Sim yelled, his voice sounding small and distorted. They ran forward and dove. There was no impact, only a sensation of falling through a viscous, warm medium. The world twisted around them, colors and sounds bleeding together into a meaningless scream. Sim felt a lurch in his stomach, a dislocation that was more than physical. For a terrifying second, he was nowhere, a speck in the void between creations. Then they tumbled out, landing hard on a surface that was neither mud nor rock. It was a spongy, resilient ground that seemed to breathe faintly under them. The light was a perpetual sour twilight. The horizons buckled and shifted, refusing to hold a straight line. Distant, insectal shapes moved against a sky the color of a day-old bruise, and on the wind rode a hymn, a droning, chittering chorus that was the voice of Ekron, Beelzebub's city. The air was thick and cloying, smelling of honey that had gone profoundly bad. They were in hell's primordial hinterlands. Umar was already moving, his sapper's instincts taking over. He pulled a wired charge from his pack and a small pinch of relic dust from a pouch at his belt. He pressed the dust into the soft ground and set the charge beside it. Even terrain that moves, he muttered, securing the wire, remembers where a promise was buried. He was marking their entry point, creating an anchor in this shifting hellscape. Sim got to his feet, his body aching from the transition. He looked at his team. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with the shock of arrival. But they were whole. They were through. The first part of the madness was over. Now the real work began. The distant hymn of Ekron seemed to grow louder, a constant, mocking reminder of where they were and what they had come to do. Chapter 4. Hinterlands of the Serpent. The air of hell was a physical weight, thick and humid, carrying the cloying stench of spoiled sweetness. The ground beneath their feet, that resilient breathing sponge, muffled their footsteps into nothing. There were no landmarks, only a rolling, buckled terrain that shifted subtly if stared at for too long. The sky remained a static, bruised purple, the insectile hymn of Ekron, a constant, droning backdrop that grated on the nerves. Sim signaled for a halt behind a ridge of what looked like black, fused bone. They had been moving for what felt like an hour, though time was a meaningless concept here. They followed a track Pavel had described in his last, frantic transmission. A path of scorched footprints that stank of ozone and despair. Maeve, at the point, suddenly froze and dropped to one knee, her hand snapping up in a closed fist. The team flattened themselves against the bone ridge. Sim edged forward, following her gaze. 100 yards ahead, a figure glided across their path. It was a hunter of the left-hand path. Tall and unnaturally slender, it moved with a fluid grace that was utterly alien. Its left arm was a horror, transformed into a living bow, the flesh stretched and hardened, nailed into place with dark, infernal iron. A cloak made from the pale skin of some stargazing oracle beast flowed from its shoulders, and across its surface blinked 100 open eyes, each pupil a pinprick of malevolent light. Maeve didn't look at it directly. Instead, she scooped up a handful of fine gray ash from a pouch at her belt and smeared it across her face, breaking up the lines of her features. She gestured urgently for the others to look down. "Don't meet its gaze," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the hellish hymn. "The cloak watches back. It writes down what looks at it. It learns you." They pressed themselves into the black bone, hearts hammering. Sim felt a cold dread seep into him. This was not a mere sentry. This was a master of this blighted realm. The hunter paused, its head tilting as if listening to a distant sound. One of the eyes on its cloak swiveled slowly in their direction. For a long, terrifying moment, Sim was certain they had been seen. But then the hunter glided on, disappearing into the folds of the distorted landscape. The team remained frozen for a full minute after it was gone, the only sound their ragged breathing. "Its sight lines are like tripwires," Maeve whispered, finally rising. "We just stepped over one. We need to move faster." They pushed on, the encounter leaving a chill that the oppressive heat could not dispel. The scorched footprints led them to a depression in the ground, a pit where the air shimmered with heat. Within it, yoke fiends stirred a massive black cauldron with crude paddles. The creatures were twisted, pitiable things, the cursed stillbirths of devils and beasts, their forms a chaotic jumble of limbs and weeping sores. They whimpered as they worked, a language that was mostly rhythm, a desperate, pulsing cadence that was somehow still a plea for mercy. Nura stared down at them, her grip tightening on her vivisector. Her professional detachment warred with a profound human revulsion. "Their suffering fuels their master's magic," she murmured to Sim, goetic energy drawn from eternal torment. One of the fiends, sensing their presence, looked up with milky, unseeing eyes and let out a low, gurgling moan. It was a sound that could attract attention from miles away in this dead land. "We can't let it raise an alarm," Sim said, his voice low. Nura nodded, her face a mask of grim resolve. "Mercy can be quiet," she said. In a single fluid motion, she vaulted into the pit. The nearest yoke fiend had no time to react. Nura drove the point of her vivisector into its chest. There was no scream, only a sharp pneumatic hiss as the cocktail of sacred compounds, nerve agents, and holy shards was injected. The fiend convulsed once, a look of almost peaceful release washing over its distorted features, and then it slumped, silent. Its torment was over. Father Thomas was beside her in an instant. He ignored the cauldron and the other cowering fiends. He knelt by the dead creature, pressed his reliquary to its fevered brow, and muttered a short prayer. Then, with a small, sharp tool, he cleanly severed one of its finger bones and pocketed it. "A promise," he said, meeting Sim's questioning look, "that even the lowest of hell will not be forgotten by the living, that someone bore witness." Sim felt a pang of something complex, admiration for the priest's compassion, mixed with a cold, tactical fear. This was a distraction. "Father, we need to move. Pity is a path that can lead deeper into hell if we let it lead." He gestured back to the trail of footprints. "We follow the map we came to draw." Nura wiped her blade clean and climbed out of the pit. The other yoke fiends had shrunk back, mewling softly, but they did not cry out. Perhaps they had seen a kindness they did not understand, and it had silenced them. They moved on, leaving the pit and its black cauldron behind. The encounter with the hunter and the fiends had made the danger visceral. This was not just a battlefield. It was a realm of systematic suffering and predatory intelligence. Every shadow could hold an eye that recorded their passage. Every sound could be a prayer to a malevolent god. Sim checked the crude compass he carried, its needle spinning lazily before settling for a moment on a point ahead. Pavel's last coordinates were close. They were nearing the ravine. The mission's objective, and its greatest peril, lay just ahead. The weight of the unnatural air felt heavier now, the hymn of Ekron a taunt. They were deep in the serpent's territory, and they could not afford another misstep. Chapter 5. The Chain and the Ledger. The scorched footprints led them into a ravine that looked as if it had been carved from the ribs of a fallen leviathan. Great, curved arches of bone, bleached white and streaked with black veins, formed the walls, rising high above them to a narrow strip of bruised sky. The air in the ravine was colder, stagnant, and carried a new sound, a low, rhythmic clinking, like chains shifting under a great weight. Sim signaled for the team to take cover behind a jumble of smaller bone fragments at the ravine's entrance. He peered over the top, and his breath caught in his throat. Suspended in the center of the ribbed canyon was Brother Pavel. He hung from a wicked chain made of living, interlocking links that seemed to pulse with a dark light. It was a tormentor chain, its hooked barbs buried deep in his flesh, drinking from him in slow, agonizing sips. Pavel was pale, his face a mask of silent suffering, but his eyes were open, and they tracked movement with a desperate awareness. He was alive, but being unmade. A few yards from him floated a sorcerer. It was a being of shifting shadows, its form barely coherent, as if woven from a sliver of a fallen angel. It had no discernible face, only a region of deeper darkness where one should be. In its shadowy hands it turned the pages of Pavel's field index, a thick, leather-bound ledger that glowed with a faint, unholy light. The sorcerer was studying the reversed psalms, the calibrations meant to defend against hell's weapons. Sim slid back down, his heart pounding. He looked at Nura. Her face was a study in controlled fury and anguish. She saw the same thing he did. Rescue and retrieval had to happen in one motion. There was no time to free Pavel and then go for the book. The sorcerer was too close, too aware. Sim held up 2 fingers, then pointed at Pavel and the index and finally made a single, swift cutting motion with his hand. One motion. Nura gave a sharp, tight nod. Her knuckles were white on the haft of her vivisector. He turned to the others, his hands sketching the plan in the air. Umar understood immediately. The sapper nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. He began to belly crawl along the base of the ribbed wall, seeding his Tufenjif mines at strategic points where the bone met the ground. He moved with an almost supernatural silence, a veteran of 100 underground fights against heretic burrowers. He then carefully wired the detonator, but instead of connecting it to a plunger, He took a length of fine wire and connected it to Father Thomas's reliquary. The priest handed it over without question. Umar murmured a prayer of his own, something in his native tongue, as he worked. "A little blessing in a blast never hurt," he whispered, securing the connection. Meanwhile, Maeve was at work with her charcoal. On a flat piece of bone, she sketched a net of countermarks, a web of Gaelic prayers and old words that had once held devils at bay on her island. She threaded the symbols together, creating a pattern designed to knot and confuse the hunter's sightlines, to blind the sorcerer to their presence for a few critical seconds. Sim checked his weapon, a standard-issue rifle that felt woefully inadequate in this place. He looked at each member of his team. Umar was in position, his hand resting on the wired reliquary. Maeve gave him a thumbs up, her sketch complete. Nura had a vivisector needle ready, a different cocktail loaded, one designed for rapid stabilization to anchor a fading soul back to the pain of the living world. Father Thomas held his beads, his lips moving in silent supplication. This was it, the moment of absolute risk. Sim took a final breath, the cloying air of hell filling his lungs. He met Pavel's eyes across the ravine. A flicker of recognition, of desperate hope, showed in the combat biologist's gaze. Sim raised his hand, fingers splayed. He counted down with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. He dropped his hand. Umar triggered the mines. The world dissolved into noise and dust. The shaped charges went off not with a massive explosion, but with a series of sharp, concussive thumps that perfectly pinched the ravine's acoustics. The blast was channeled, a controlled violence that sent a cloud of pulverized bone and holy relic dust directly into the sorcerer. The shadowy figure shrieked, a sound like bells rung backward, its form scattering momentarily in the blinding cloud. On cue, Sim and Nura burst from cover. Sim sprinted to Pavel, his rifle forgotten. He drew a heavy trench knife and began hacking at the living links of the tormentor chain. The metal shrieked under his blows, bleeding a black, viscous fluid. Each strike sent a jolt of agony through Pavel, but the man gritted his teeth, his eyes locked on Sim's. Nura was there a second later. As the last link gave way, she caught Pavel's falling weight, staggering under his bulk. Without hesitation, she drove a vivisector needle into the side of his neck. There was another hiss, and Pavel's body arched, a raw human scream tearing from his throat, a blessed sound after the silent torment. He was back in the world of pain, and that meant he was still alive. The sorcerer reformed with a furious shriek. It flailed its shadowy hands, and crawling goetic runes, like burning insects, flew through the air towards them. But Maeve was already there. She stepped forward, her boots crushing the runes before they could land, stamping them out with a fierce determination. "They cannot learn your name if you don't let them speak it," she yelled. "Go," Sim shouted, slinging Pavel's arm over his shoulder. Nura had the field index clutched under her own arm. They stumbled back towards the ravine entrance, their retreat covered by Umar's shotgun blasts into the swirling dust and Maeve's relentless disruption of the sorcerer's magic. They had him. They had the index. But the ravine was now fully awake, and their theft had been discovered. The clock was ticking down to 0. Their run for the tier was about to begin. Chapter 6. Run for the tier. The relative silence of the ravine shattered into a cacophony of hellish alarm. From ledges high on the ribbed walls, a Praetorian cohort loosed its warriors. Hell Knights, their forms encased in black, rune-etched armor that seemed to absorb the sickly light, dropped to the ground with earth-shaking thuds. They were silent, their visors revealing only darkness, but their swords, ancient and jagged, hummed with malevolent energy. From fissures in the ground, pit locusts began to spill forth, a seething, razor-legged swarm the size of large dogs, their chittering a vile praise to the court of the seven-headed serpent. Umar stood his ground, a rock against the tide. He fired his Alebozan shotgun into the advancing locusts. The experimental weapon barked, its widespread tearing great gaps in the swarm, each shot a concussive blast of shot and alchemical fire. "Even hell ducks for buckshot," he roared, a defiant grin cracking his normally stoic face. His covering fire bought them precious seconds, a handful of breaths to orient themselves and run. "Anchor, stiletto, move," Sim yelled, his voice straining under Pavel's weight. The combat biologist was semi-conscious, his feet dragging in the spongy earth. Nura, the field index tucked securely under her arm, took Pavel's other side, and together they half-dragged, half-carried him back the way they had come. Maeve fell in behind them, her rifle cracking as she fired precise shots at the Hell Knight's joints, slowing their advance. They burst out of the ribbed ravine and back into the buckled hinterlands. The path of scorched footprints was their only guide, a thread of sanity through the shifting nightmare. But their flight was not to go unchallenged. As they scrambled up a rise, the hunter of the left-hand path slid across their path once more, materializing from the distorted air as if he were part of it. His oracle skin cloak billowed, 100 eyes blinking in unison, fixing on them. He did not speak. He simply snapped his tormentor chain. The chain uncoiled through the air with a life of its own, its hooked barbs seeking flesh. It missed Sim and Nura, but its end whipped around, and the hooks dug deep, not into skin, but into memory. Sim cried out as a wave of debilitating sorrow washed over him. He saw Alyssa, not as a ghost in the static, but vivid and real, smiling at him just before the shell hit their dugout. The memory was a physical pain, a hook in his soul, threatening to anchor him to this spot in despair. The chain was feeding on his loss, using it to paralyze him. He stumbled, Pavel's weight almost dragging him down. He was lost, caught in a snare of his own grief. Father Thomas did not hesitate. He stepped forward directly into the chain's path. He grabbed the living links with both hands, ignoring the hooks that bit into his palms. His reliquary, still wired to Umar's detonator, flared with a brilliant, pure white light. The holy energy surged through the chain, and for a single miraculous second, the hooks forgot their work. The agonizing memories released their grip. The chain went slack. "Go!" the priest gasped, his face contorted in pain and effort. The chain was already beginning to remember, to thirst again. Umar saw the hunter, saw Father Thomas holding the chain at bay. He made a decision in a heartbeat. He tossed his shotgun to Maeve, shouted, "Cover them," and charged. He was not a young man, but he was a veteran sapper, and his charge had the weight of a landslide. He tackled the hunter around the waist, driving the slender figure to the ground. As they wrestled, Umar jammed one of his remaining Tufengief mines into the hunter's belt. The hunter threw him off with unnatural strength, rising with a shriek of rage. Umar lay on the ground, looking up at the creature. He spoke a single word, the first of the 99 names of God, a word of power and creation. The mine detonated. The blast was not large, but it was focused. It folded the canyon's echo in on itself, directing all its force inward. The concussive wave hit the hunter and Umar simultaneously. The hunter was flung backwards, his cloak of eyes shredded, his living bow arm shattered. Umar did not move again. The geometry of his own blast had claimed him. "Keystone is down," Maeve screamed, her voice raw. There was no time to mourn. The seam they had come through was visible ahead, a shimmering, unstable scar in the air. But it was shrinking, pulsing erratically as the second stanza of the infernal barrage reached its climax back in the real world. Nura shoved Pavel towards the tier. "Go! Go!" Maeve grabbed Sim by his harness, hauling him forward. "Grief is a snare too, Anchor. Move!" Sim shook off the last vestiges of the chain's psychic venom. He saw Umar's body, saw the shrinking tier. He saw Nura trying to get Pavel through. He lunged forward, adding his strength to hers. They shoved Pavel into the shimmering membrane. The tier stuttered, the world beyond flickering, a glimpse of mud, of sandbags, of stuttering flares. It was their only way home. They had to take it, now. Chapter 7. The Choice at Pulpit 9. The tier shrunk from a gaping maw to the size of a doorway, then smaller, to a narrow portal that pulsed with frantic, dying energy. The shriek of the damned world behind them was a physical pressure, pushing them toward the exit. Nura shoved the semi-conscious Pavel toward the shimmering seam. He stumbled forward, but the bulky field index under Nura's arm made the passage tight, impossible for both man and book to pass at once. Sim saw the calculation in a split second. The seam was closing fast, the edges crackling like burning parchment. There was no way. The world was refusing them. The choice was brutal, immediate, and absolute. Nura's face, usually a mask of clinical detachment, was contorted with a terrible anguish. She looked from Pavel to the heavy index in her hands. This was the data she had sworn to protect, the reason for her order's existence. But she also saw the man she had failed once before. In that moment, every rule she had ever written in her neat, precise hand broke. "The man, Sim," she begged, her voice cracking. "Choose the man. I can rewrite the numbers if a mind survives to remember them. I can't rewrite him." Maeve acted without hesitation. She ripped the index from Nura's grasp, tore out a thick sheaf of pages marked with Pavel's personal cipher, and stuffed them into her vest. The rest of the book, the bulk of the data, she let fall. "I tested reverse psalms on empty trenches for 3 years," she yelled over the hellish din. "I can fill the gaps, trust me." Father Thomas stepped forward, placing himself between them and the reforming sorcerer. He began to pray, not a forbidden psalm, but an old one, a hymn of protection and safe passage. His voice, steady and firm, seemed to impose a fragile order on the chaotic energy of the closing tier. The seam shuddered, and for a heartbeat it held its size, stabilized by the force of his faith. It was enough. Sim made the choice. He thrust Pavel through the tier with all his strength. The combat biologist vanished into the flickering image of Pulpit 9. Sim then turned, grabbing Nura by her harness. He shoved her toward the opening. As she passed through, he saw the remainder of the field index, the invaluable ledger, slide away from Maeve's feet, sinking into the black, breathing ground of hell like a book sinking into a tar pit. It was gone. Behind them, the hunter rose from the ground, coughing black smoke. One side of his body was a ruin from Umar's mine, but he was still moving, still lethal. Umar did not rise. Sim took one last look at the veteran sapper who had given his life to pinch the world shut. Then he dove for the tier. He felt a terrible stretching sensation, a cold hook of hell trying to pull him back. Then he was through, tumbling out into the mud and familiar stink of Pulpit 9. He landed hard on the ground, the roar of the real barrage crashing over him like a wave. It was deafening, ordinary, and it hurt less because it was a pain of the body, not the soul. The tier sealed behind him with a sound like a scab tearing off, leaving nothing but a faint smell of ozone and a patch of scorched earth. Sim lay in the mud, gasping. Beside him, Nura was already crawling toward Pavel, who lay moaning on the ground. Maeve stood over them, her rifle scanning the darkness, her body tense. They were back. They had lost Umar. They had lost the index, but they had brought Pavel out. From the trench radio in the nearby dugout, the static hissed, a constant, white noise companion to the guns. For a moment, Sim thought he heard the faint, questioning lilt that had haunted him for so long. He looked at Nura stitching Pavel's wounds, at Maeve guarding them, at the empty space where Umar should have been. He reached out a muddy hand and turned the radio's dial, clicking it off. The static died, and with it, the ghost of his wife's voice faded. He did not need to listen to the echoes of the dead anymore. The breath of the living beside him was the only channel he needed to tune. He had chosen, and he would live with the choice. The ordinary, brutal weather of the trenches was a blessing after the hinterlands of the serpent. Chapter 8. The Work of the Living. The dugout beneath Pulpit 9 felt like a sanctuary after the shifting horrors of the infernal hinterlands. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and antiseptic, was a welcome anchor to reality. Medics worked quickly around Brother Pavel, who lay on a stretcher, his breathing shallow but steady. They reset the fractures caused by the tormentor chain's hooks, their movements efficient and practiced. Nura al-Kindi was never far from his side, her vivisector laid aside for a surgeon's needle and thread. She sutured his physical wounds with a steady hand, while whispering promises to his unconscious form, promises of recovery, of survival, that were part medicine and part prayer. The frantic energy of the rescue had been replaced by the focused calm of preservation. The relative peace was shattered by the arrival of the Red Brigade adjutant, a man whose face was permanently creased with the strain of logistics and loss. He stalked into the dugout, his eyes immediately scanning for the prize. "The index," he demanded, his voice tight. "Where is the field index? The Synod's observers are already en route. The calibrations inside that book could save thousands." Sim stood up, his body aching in every muscle. He met the adjutant's gaze without flinching. "The index is lost," he said, his voice flat. "It remains in hell." The adjutant's face purpled. "Lost? You were tasked with its retrieval. The Synod of Strategic Prophecy does not accept failure, Rook. The strategic value of a living mind is greater, Nura interrupted, not looking up from her work. Her voice was cold, sharp as her scalpel. And we have both. Before the adjutant could retort, Maeve O'Carroll stepped forward. She said nothing. Instead, she reached into her vest and carefully laid out the sheaf of pages she had torn from the index. They were crumpled and stained with mud and what might have been blood, but the cipher marks Pavel used, a complex code of alchemical symbols and musical notation, were clearly visible on the topmost sheets. She smoothed them on an ammunition crate with a grim finality. At that moment, Pavel stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and powerful sedatives, but aware. He saw the pages and his lips moved. A rasping sound emerged, then coalesced into a sequence of numbers, a cadence. It was the missing harmonic, the key to predicting the second, soul-peeling stanza of the sacrilege mortars. He recited it like a man finishing a hymn he thought he had forgotten, his voice gaining a sliver of strength with each syllable. The dugout fell silent, save for Pavel's rasp and the distant, ever-present thump of artillery. The adjutant stared, his anger replaced by a stunned awe. The arrival of the Synod's observer was a quiet event. He entered without fanfare, an oculus-helmed figure whose face was entirely hidden by the smooth, featureless orichalcum of his helmet. He did not speak to anyone, but stood listening as Pavel repeated the cadence, his head tilted as if hearing a distant, divine voice. After a full minute, the observer gave a single sharp nod. "The cadence is verified," he announced, his voice a synthetic hum from within the helmet. "This will allow us to predict the second beat. We can spare whole companies from the blasts." He collected the pages with a gloved hand, turned, and left as silently as he had arrived. The strategic value had been retrieved, not in full, but in the part that mattered most. In the aftermath, the grim accounting began. Sim found a piece of scrap paper and a pencil. He wrote Umar's full name, his rank in the Sultanate's sapper corps, and the date. He wrote a short, truthful account of the sapper's sacrifice, how his charge had pinched the tear and broken the hunter, buying their escape. It was a letter for the House of Wisdom, so that Umar's name would be recorded among his people's heroes. Sim sealed the letter, but before he did, he tucked inside a small bent nail he found in his cuff, a nail of infernal iron, pried from the hunter's transformed arm. Let the truth travel with a token, a piece of the horror they had faced, to those who had loved him. Father Thomas's empty vest was found and placed under the lamp in the regiment's small trench chapel. Beside it, the priest had laid the yoke fiend's finger bone, the promise he had made in the pit. In death, a stubborn priest and the lowest creature of hell would keep each other company in a place where the sacrilege shells could not reach, a silent testament to a mercy offered in the midst of damnation. Later, as a bruised twilight settled over the trenches, Sim walked the lip of Pulpit 9 with Maeve and Nura. The stuttering flares were beginning their nightly dance over no man's land. The air still held the coppery tang of the infernal barrage, but it was fading, becoming just another scent in the vast bouquet of war. "He'll live," Nura said, her gaze fixed on the wasteland. "Pavel, it will be a long recovery, but he will live. His mind is intact." The pages she saved, Maeve added, nodding toward Nura, they contained the core of his work. The rest was commentary. We have what we need. Sim listened to them, to the living breath of his comrades. He looked out at the darkness where the wire listened and the static sometimes lied. "If another door opens," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "we will go again." He turned to look at them, his face etched with the fatigue and resolve of the trenches. "But next time," he promised, "we will carry a second pair of hands for the one we mean to bring back." It was not a vow of victory, or even of survival. It was a simpler oath, the only one that held meaning in the endless crusade. They would go into the dark again, and they would strive to return with all they had taken in. It was the work of the living, and for now, it was enough.